He built a trap made of sheer misery to capture a heart of pure gold, hiding the greatest fortune of the mountains behind a crumbling wall of loose stones. Can you even begin to imagine the blend of desperation and courage it takes for a woman to willingly live in an abandoned hovel on the edge of a precipice, just to escape the coldness and cruelty of the city? Yet this breathtaking story, filled with unexpected twists, actually took place during the bitter winter of 1934 in the majestic and isolated Crystal Valley, high up in the Cascade Mountains. Before I tell you how this extraordinary woman changed her own destiny forever, let me know down in the comments which city and state you are tuning in from to follow this story, because I absolutely love seeing how far our narratives are traveling. The freezing wind of that January morning sliced through the air like an invisible razor, sweeping the dry pine needles and making the heavy frost sparkle like crushed glass across the lawns. Vincent stood on the massive white marble veranda of his estate, the Crystal Manor, a colossal architectural marvel built by his grandfather decades earlier. The mansion boasted 72 rooms, imported French crystal chandeliers that chimed with the breeze, hand-carved solid mahogany furniture, and authentic Persian rugs that muffled the hurried footsteps of dozens of servants. He was the sole heir to an incalculable fortune, the owner of a vast timber empire and sprawling apple orchards that supplied markets and ports across the entire nation. At 35 years old, Vincent had the world at his feet, overflowing bank accounts and the fearful respect of every timber baron and state politician in the region. But inside, his chest harbored a silent, aching emptiness. He had just called off his engagement to a young woman from Seattle high society after overhearing her confide in a friend that she only tolerated Vincent's quiet demeanor because the land deeds and diamonds more than made up for any boredom. Those words hit him with the force of a punch to the gut. It wasn't the first time. Ever since he had inherited the family fortune, Vincent realized that people no longer looked into his deep brown eyes, nor did they care about the calluses and scars on his hands from the days he still insisted on helping with the logging and harvests. People only looked at his pockets. Women smiled at the gold, never at the man. Consumed by a profound bitterness and fiercely determined never to be anyone's financial trophy again, Vincent made a drastic decision that would alter the course of his existence. On that very same freezing morning, he summoned old Silas, the grizzled estate foreman with silver hair and a face deeply weathered by the sun, who was his most trusted confidant. Vincent ordered that all the servants be dismissed immediately with a full month's wages paid in advance, and that the massive oak doors of the manor be locked tight with heavy iron chains. Old Silas, utterly bewildered, asked if his employer was losing his mind to a sickness. Vincent merely offered a sad smile and explained that he needed to fall sick with poverty to see if he could somehow cure his soul. He stripped off his tailored British wool suits, his fine Italian leather shoes, and his gold pocket watch. Instead, he put on a pair of faded denim trousers, a flannel shirt frayed at the elbows, and slid his feet into old mud-caked work boots. Leaving all luxury behind, he walked for nearly 2 hours through a dense, shadowy forest of towering Douglas firs until he reached the most extreme and treacherous edge of his vast lands. There, precariously perched on the lip of a terrifying cliff, sat an old cabin made of irregular stones, built over 50 years ago by trappers and long since abandoned. The place was the very picture of desolation. The roof, patched with rotting thatch and rusted tin, was riddled with holes, allowing the sunlight and rain to enter uninvited. The floor was nothing but packed dirt, hard as cement in the dry season, but destined to become a mud pit on stormy days. The only wood stove had a rusted, cracked iron top, and the wooden front door shrieked like a mournful ghost with every gust of wind. There was no furniture, save for a wooden pallet lined with dry straw that served as a bed, and a rickety table leaning heavily against the wall just to stay upright. However, if the cabin was the hell of sheer destitution, the view from its single window was heaven on earth. The hovel faced an infinite valley where a sea of wild hydrangeas exploded in vibrant shades of blue and purple during the spring thaw, and right next to it, a majestic waterfall plunged from a height of 130 feet, creating an eternal rainbow in the mist of crystal-clear water that rose from the abyss. It was a place where human poverty clashed violently against the breathtaking wealth of nature. It was exactly there that Vincent decided to live. He instructed old Silas to head down to the town of Oakhaven, which sat 11 miles down the mountain, and plant a very specific rumor. The foreman was to casually mention at the general stores, the trading posts, and the town square that there was a desperately poor man, a simple lumberjack named Vincent, living in a crumbling stone shack up on the ridge. The man was looking for a wife, a true companion, to share his meager bread, the biting cold, and the back-breaking labor of the land, in exchange for nothing but honest respect and a roof over her head, even if that roof leaked. Vincent wanted to test the heart of the world. He wanted to discover if there still existed, anywhere in the universe, a woman capable of loving a man who had absolutely nothing to offer but the strength of his own 2 arms and his unwavering loyalty. The news spread like a wildfire through dry brush across the small town of Oakhaven. During the 1930s, life in the rural countryside was unforgiving, and marriage was often viewed as the only life raft for young women without means or inheritance. Over the following weeks, driven either by morbid curiosity or sheer desperation, a few women from the town decided to brave the mountain trek to meet the mysterious lumberjack. But the outcome was always exactly the same. When they reached the top of the ridge, breathless and exhausted, and laid eyes on the miserable, dark stone hovel, pure disgust overtook their features. Vincent, playing the part of a ruined man to perfection, would greet them with soot-stained hands and a sweat-streaked face, offering them well water in a severely dented aluminum mug. The reaction was always immediate. Some turned on their heels and marched away without uttering a single syllable. Others laughed in his face with open contempt. Eleanor, the local pharmacist's daughter, a 22-year-old known for her cruel vanity and stiffly starched dresses, was the most merciless of all. Looking down at the dirt floor and the broken stove, Eleanor covered her nose with a lavender-scented lace handkerchief and declared loudly that she would prefer death over living like a wild animal in the brush. She called Vincent an insolent beggar for daring to ask for a decent woman's hand just to drag her down into the mud with him. Vincent absorbed the insults in complete silence, his head bowed, but inside he felt a strange mix of sorrow and profound relief. The test was working flawlessly. The trap effectively kept the greedy away, but it also left him feeling increasingly isolated and deeply disillusioned with humanity. While Vincent navigated his self-imposed loneliness, accompanied only by the constant roar of the waterfall at the top of the cliff, life continued its relentless, unforgiving rhythm down in the valley. Down in the town of Oakhaven, far removed from Eleanor's starched dresses and the gossip circles of the main square, lived Sophia. At 24 years old, Sophia was a woman who had known the crushing weight of the world from a very young age. She was a laundress who lived in a damp, rented room in the back of a dilapidated boarding house, paying her landlord with nearly every drop of sweat she produced. Life had never handed her anything easy. Sophia was entirely alone in the world. She had lost her parents many years ago to the sheer exhaustion of a lifetime of hard labor in the fields. Her only inheritance was an unbreakable character and a pure honesty that shone brightly in her serene, deep brown eyes. Every single day, long before the sun even thought of rising, she walked down to the freezing banks of Boulder Creek, hauling heavy bundles of soiled laundry from the wealthy families of the town. The river water in January was so dreadfully cold that her hands were perpetually cracked, red and calloused, burning fiercely every time she scrubbed the harsh lye soap into the thick fabrics. Despite all her hardships, the hunger that frequently gnawed at her stomach, and the bitter cold that seeped into her windowless room, Sophia never allowed bitterness to poison her spirit. She sang softly to herself as she beat the clothes against the river rocks, paying close attention to the songs of the morning birds, the shifting shapes of the clouds, and the earthy scent of damp soil. She firmly believed that human dignity did not reside in the fabric of the clothes one wore, but in the peaceful conscience of the person laying their head on the pillow at night. Deep down in her solitary heart, however, Sophia harbored a quiet, burning desire. She didn't dream of fancy carriages, silk dresses, or royal banquets. Her single, most profound yearning was to have a home. A place of her own, no matter how desperately humble, where she could plant a pot of basil by the door, sweep the floor while humming a tune, and have someone with whom she could share a hot pot of coffee and the comfortable silences of the late afternoon. She wanted someone who would respect her and see the true value that existed beneath her patched and faded clothes. It was on a late Tuesday afternoon, while buying a pound of cornmeal at Mrs. Higgins' general store and counting out her pennies one by one, that Sophia overheard a conversation. Two women were laughing loudly, mocking the tale of the crazy lumberjack who lived in a stone hovel in Crystal Valley and was trying to find a wife to starve alongside him. They described the place using the most wretched words imaginable, going on and on about the patched roof, the mud floor, and the biting wind. Mrs. Higgins, standing behind the counter, shook her head in clear disapproval of the women's malice, and muttered that at least the man, whose name was Vincent, was a hard worker with strong arms who offered what little he had without deceiving a soul. Sophia stopped counting her coins. Her heart did a strange, sudden leap inside her chest. While the other women saw nothing but disgrace and squalor in the story, Sophia's mind painted an entirely different picture. She imagined a lonely man, battered by life, but honest enough not to hide his harsh reality. She thought to herself that a leaky roof on top of a mountain, surrounded by the solemn silence of the trees and the vastness of the sky, was infinitely better than the damp, mouldy walls of her boarding-house room, where she was subjected to the constant screaming matches of her neighbors and the cruel demands of her landlord. That very same night, sitting on her hard, narrow bed and wrapped in a threadbare blanket that did nothing to chase away the midnight chill, Sophia made the biggest decision of her life. She had absolutely nothing to lose. If the lumberjack was a respectful man, willing to put in an honest day's work, she was more than ready to turn any dirt floor into the warmest home in the world. She gathered her few earthly belongings, which consisted of 2 worn-out cotton dresses, a hairbrush, a needle and thread, and the heavy brown wool shawl that had once belonged to her mother. She tied it all neatly into a cloth bundle, took a deep breath, and waited for the dawn. The climb up the mountain was punishing. The trail was incredibly steep, littered with loose rocks and thick roots that stubbornly tried to trip her at every turn. The air grew thinner and increasingly frigid as Sophia left the town of Oakhaven far behind her. Her worn-out shoes offered almost no protection against the jagged path, and the physical exertion made her lungs burn. But with every step she took higher into the mountains, the heavy scent of town smoke, pollution, and sewage was gradually replaced by the crisp, invigorating aroma of pine, morning dew, and virgin earth. She had to stop a few times to catch her breath, leaning heavily with her hands on her knees, but the thought of giving up never crossed her mind. In the distance, she began to hear a deep, continuous rumble, a powerful roar that made the ground vibrate faintly beneath her worn soles. It was the great waterfall of Crystal Valley. The sound guided her through the final stretch of the trail, until the dense forest of Douglas firs suddenly gave way, revealing the jagged edge of the cliff. The scenery completely took the young laundress's breath away, but not because of the horrors the other women had described. Sophia was utterly mesmerized. The mist rising from the waterfall created a magical atmosphere around the rustic stone cabin, making it look as though it had grown naturally out of the mountain itself. The sea of wild hydrangeas danced wildly in the wind, painting the ridge in deep hues of blue. It was brutal, it was untamed, it was impoverished, but it possessed an overwhelming raw beauty. Finally, her eyes found Vincent. He was at the back of the cabin, facing away from her, splitting firewood with a heavy iron axe. The sharp crack of metal biting into wood echoed loudly across the ridge. He wore the torn flannel shirt, and the muscles in his back shifted powerfully with the exertion of the heavy labor. Sweat glistened on the back of his neck, seemingly immune to the biting winter cold of the Cascades. Sophia cleared her throat gently, trying to soothe her dry vocal cords, and took a step forward, her shoe snapping a dry twig with a loud crack. Vincent froze mid-swing. He slowly lowered the axe, turned on his heels, and locked eyes with her. The man's face was shadowed by a rough scruff and set into a hard expression forged by deep suspicion. He measured her up and down. He saw the humble cloth bundle, the deteriorating shoes, and the faded simple dress. But what truly arrested his attention were her eyes. There was no fear in them. There was no disgust, and there was none of that calculating gleam of someone trying to appraise the monetary value of their surroundings. There was only a bone-deep exhaustion, mingled with a quiet, undeniable hope. Even so, Vincent couldn't afford to make it easy. He had to be cruel with the truth to test the resilience of this woman who had just wandered into his yard. With a voice intentionally rough, grating like coarse sandpaper, he demanded to know what she was doing there, warning her immediately that he didn't have a single dime to hand out for charity. Sophia didn't flinch. She gripped her bundle a little tighter, lifted her chin slightly, and replied with a soft, steady voice that she wasn't there looking for handouts. She explained that she had heard down in the town that an honest man needed a companion to help with the daily chores and share the burden of life, and that if the rumor was true, she was fully prepared to try. Vincent narrowed his eyes, genuinely taken aback by the unshakable firmness of her answer, but he fiercely maintained his charade. He drove the axe head deep into the wooden stump, wiped his grimy hands on his dirty trousers, and marched toward her, pointing at the dilapidated cabin with visible disdain. He spoke harshly, telling her to take a long, hard look at the place before making any romantic, foolish decisions. He warned her that the roof rained indoors, that the wind howled mercilessly through the cracks all night, that the floor turned into a swamp, that the stove barely kept a fire, and that there was absolutely nothing in the pantry except for rock-hard beans and plain flour. He finished his bitter speech by declaring that living there was a punishment, and that poverty was the only true master of that land. He fully expected her to retreat. He expected her to do exactly what Eleanor had done, cover her face with her hands, and run crying back to the comforts of civilization. But Sophia did the exact opposite. She tore her gaze away from Vincent's severe face and walked slowly, deliberately, toward the door of the hovel. She studied the dark, uneven stones, looked up at the patched, sagging roof, and then turned to face the sheer immensity of the roaring waterfall nearby. A gentle, absolutely genuine smile blossomed at the corner of her lips. She looked back at Vincent and, with a tranquil certainty that completely disarmed him, replied that dirt floors are easy to sweep, that holes in a roof can be patched with mud and dried straw, and that the rushing water from that beautiful falls looked capable of washing away any sadness that poverty might bring. She softly added that where there is mutual respect and a willingness to work hard, the rest can be built with their own two hands. She told him, without a shadow of a doubt, that she would infinitely prefer sharing flour and hard beans with a good, honest man than eating a lavish banquet surrounded by the fake smiles of the city. Sophia's words struck Vincent's chest with the concussive force of a silent lightning bolt. His heart, which he truly believed had been petrified by years of cynicism, skipped a wild, erratic beat. He swallowed hard, struggling desperately to maintain his rigid posture as a miserable, hardened lumberjack, and merely gave a curt nod, gesturing for her to step inside. The test had miraculously passed its first phase, but the grueling reality of daily coexistence would be the true trial by fire. When Sophia stepped over the threshold into the cabin, the shock of reality hit her hard. The smell of mildew and stale soot was overpowering, and the freezing cold seemed to be permanently trapped within the thick stone walls. Yet, she didn't let out a single sigh of complaint or regret. Instantly, she placed her small bundle in the driest corner she could find, rolled up the sleeves of her thin cotton dress, and got straight to work. She found an old, crude broom made of tied branches and began vigorously sweeping the dirt floor, trying to level out the worst of the ruts and holes. Then she picked up a severely rusted tin bucket and walked out to the creek formed by the waterfall runoff, enduring the agonizingly freezing water to bring a full bucket back to the cabin. Vincent watched her every move from a distance, pretending to be deeply occupied with mending a broken fence. But he found it impossible to tear his eyes away from this woman. The swift agility with which she moved, the complete absence of complaining, the way she seemed utterly determined to drag dignity into that dark, miserable pigsty. It all left him completely astounded. By the end of that first afternoon, the atmosphere in the cabin had already shifted. Sophia had scrubbed the rusted top of the iron stove with wet sand until the worst of the decay was gone. She masterfully coaxed a fire to life using tiny, dry twigs and had a pot of water boiling. She had ventured to the edges of the tree line, gathered a handful of wild mint and herbs, and brewed a steaming pot of hot tea. When Vincent finally stepped inside, exhausted and covered in sweat, he was greeted by the welcoming aroma of herbal tea and clean wood smoke, a scent that hadn't graced that space in decades. Sophia was sitting quietly on the crude wooden bench, her pale face softly illuminated by the flickering warm light of the stove's flames. She pointed gracefully to the only intact aluminum mug on the table, where the tea was steaming, and told him with a shy, sweet smile that the water was hot enough to chase the mountain chill from his bones. Vincent walked over to the table in absolute silence. As he reached out his large hand to pick up the mug, his rough, heavily calloused fingers accidentally brushed against Sophia's bruised, freezing hands. The physical contact lasted for only a fraction of a second, but an invisible, electric spark seemed to arc through the air between them. Vincent pulled his hand back quickly, feeling his face flush with a heat that had absolutely nothing to do with the roaring fire in the stove. He mumbled a gruff, rustic thank you, diverting his gaze downward to the swept dirt floor, while Sophia lowered her head, a delicate blush coloring her pale cheeks. In that tiny, fleeting gesture, in that shared exchange of embarrassed glances, and in the surprisingly comfortable silence that settled over the miserable hovel, the very first seed of something vastly greater than Vincent had ever planned was planted. The incredibly wealthy man, who was pretending to be destitute to escape the world, had just found the only person who made the world worth living in. But his deep-seated fear of betrayal still held the reins, and the brutal trials of that unforgiving winter were only just beginning to test the absolute limits of Sophia's body and soul. And far worse than the cruelty of nature would be the upcoming storms caused by human malice, which would soon climb that mountain to try and destroy the fragile peace she was fighting so hard to build. Night fell heavily over Crystal Valley, crushing and freezing, wrapping the little stone cabin in a deep darkness where two incredibly lonely hearts were slowly trying to learn how to beat to the exact same rhythm. The first 3 weeks on top of the Crystal Valley cliff were an absolutely merciless test, not just for their bodies, which were battered by the brutal winter of 1934, but for the souls of two people desperately trying to understand each other's silences. The month of January brought with it frosts so severe that the pre-dawn hours painted the hydrangea fields with a thick, glittering layer of ice, transforming the entire landscape around the stone cabin into a frozen, blindingly white desert. The howling wind that rose from the waterfall's abyss met no resistance, violently invading the cabin through the gaps in the rusted tin roof and whistling like a continuous, mournful wail throughout the pitch-black nights. Any other woman from the town of Oakhaven would have packed her cloth bundle and fled down the mountain on the very first morning, cursing the freezing misery. But Sophia was not just any woman. Every single dawn, long before the first timid rays of the grey sun even dared to peek over the horizon, she was already on her feet. She stepped barefoot onto the packed dirt floor, which was as agonizingly cold as a block of solid ice. She draped her single, worn, brown wool shawl tightly over her thin shoulders and began the daily, grueling battle for survival and dignity. Vincent, lying on his crude wooden pallet in the opposite corner of the room, would pretend to be fast asleep just so he could watch her through half-closed eyelids. He watched her coax the wood stove to life with infinite patience, gently blowing on the dying embers, until the fire finally caught and bathed her pale face in a warm, golden glow. The comforting smell of burning eucalyptus wood soon filled the small space, mingling perfectly with the sharp aroma of the weak, stretched-out coffee she brewed through an old cotton rag. A tight, painful knot formed in Vincent's throat every single morning. He, the wealthiest and most powerful man in the entire Cascade Mountain range, the owner of sprawling mansions and endless agricultural empires, was lying there, huddled under a scratchy, rustic blanket, watching a woman with a heart of pure gold battle a manufactured poverty that he himself had invented. Every time Sophia smiled as she handed him the dented, steaming aluminum mug, wishing him a good morning in her soft voice, heavy with genuine hope, the guilt physically tore at Vincent's chest. He listened to her cheerfully declare that it was a beautiful day outside, completely ignoring the bitter cold that cracked her lips, and his heart, once hardened by deep suspicion and dark cynicism, began to melt completely, just like the morning frost under the midday sun. Their daily coexistence slowly revealed the true, undeniable nature of the feelings beginning to blossom in that barren soil. There were no luxuries, there were no expensive gifts, but a deep complicity was being built through tiny gestures and the lingering, quiet looks they exchanged during their back-breaking labor. One afternoon, while Vincent was up high trying to repair a section of the rotting roof that threatened to cave in, Sophia stepped close, holding an improvised ladder made of thick vines and branches. She anchored it with her entire body weight so he wouldn't slip. A sudden, violent gust of wind blew across the ridge, throwing Vincent off balance. He scrambled down hastily, deeply scratching his forearm on a thick, rusted iron nail on the way down. Instantly, Sophia's brown eyes flooded with pure panic. Without uttering a single word, she grabbed his arm, pulled him inside the cabin, and meticulously washed the wound with freezing, crystal-clear water from the falls. Then, without a second thought, she grabbed the hem of her only good cotton dress and violently tore a strip of fabric to bind the wound. As she carefully wrapped the makeshift bandage around his muscular arm, Vincent stared down at the delicate movement of her fingers, her hands rough and calloused from years of washing laundry, and breathed in the faint, clean scent of lye soap that naturally emanated from her skin. He mumbled a thick, choked-up thank you, telling her she didn't need to ruin her clothes for him. Sophia merely smiled, a shy, radiant smile that reached all the way to her eyes, and whispered back that cloth can always be sewn together again, but the health of a good, honest man is priceless in this world. Vincent's face burned hot. He fought an overwhelming, nearly uncontrollable urge to pull her into his arms, hold her tight, and pour out the entire truth. But the terrifying fear of shattering the sheer purity of that beautiful moment paralyzed him completely. He needed absolute, undeniable proof that this love wasn't a fragile illusion before he opened the grand doors to his real world. If you are loving seeing how true, undeniable love is born in the absolute simplicity and honesty of two pure hearts, don't forget to like this story and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the unfolding of this deeply emotional journey. In the grueling days that followed, Vincent tried his best to compensate for the harshness of his test with tiny, secret gestures of affection disguised as daily routine. Using his old, sharpened pocket knife and a soft block of cedar wood he found deep in the forest, he spent 3 consecutive nights secretly carving something by the faint, flickering light of the dying embers. When he finally finished, he waited until Sophia took her usual spot, sitting in the cabin's doorway to watch the sunset. The sky was a breathtaking canvas of burning oranges and deep violets, reflecting beautifully in the thick mist of the waterfall. He approached her slowly, cleared his throat awkwardly to mask his intense nerves, and reached out his hand, offering her a perfectly hand-carved wooden comb. The teeth had been meticulously sanded down with smooth river stones so they wouldn't scratch her scalp. The sweet, earthy scent of raw cedar drifted into the crisp evening air. Sophia took the object with both hands, holding it as reverently as if he had just handed her a crown of solid gold. Her eyes instantly welled up with thick tears. Vincent, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly, mumbled an explanation. He said he had noticed how she struggled to untangle her long, thick hair with her fingers every morning, and mentioned that cedarwood leaves a pleasant scent in the strands. Sophia pressed the carved comb tightly against her chest and confessed, her voice thick and trembling with raw emotion, that it was the most beautiful gift she had ever received in her entire life. She knew deep in her soul that every single tooth of that comb carried his precious time, his effort, and his profound care. It was the very first time their eyes met and locked without any walls or reservations, heavily laden with deep tenderness and a quiet, silent flirtation, where their souls seemed to converse without the need for a single spoken word. That rustic wooden comb was worth more to Sophia than all the dazzling diamonds in the capital city, and to Vincent, the blinding shine of the tears of gratitude running down her face was the final, absolute confirmation that he had found the greatest treasure on earth. However, the fragile bubble of peace they had painstakingly built on top of the mountain was about to be violently tested by the cruelty of the outside world. The flour sack was completely empty, the salt jar was scraped bare to the glass, and the relentless cold demanded heavier, heartier meals for their bodies to endure the labor. Vincent, clenching his fists in silent rage at having to subject her to yet another humiliation just to maintain his disguise, handed Sophia a meager handful of nickels and pennies, barely enough pocket change to buy the absolute bare necessities. He apologized profusely for the miserable amount, his voice heavy with genuine remorse, telling her it was all a poor lumberjack could scrape together after a brutally hard week. Sophia carefully tucked the coins into the pocket of her dress, gently touched Vincent's broad shoulder, and assured him not to worry. She promised him she knew how to haggle well, and that God would surely multiply the little they had. She draped her woolen shawl over her head, picked up her woven straw basket, and began the long, exhausting 11-mile descent back down to the town of Oakhaven. What Sophia didn't know was that Vincent, utterly consumed by a fierce protective instinct and crushing guilt, did not stay behind at the cabin. The very second she disappeared around the bend of the Douglas Fir Trail, he took a steep, treacherous shortcut known only to him and old Silas. He practically flew down the side of the mountain, absolutely determined to watch over her from the shadows to ensure she arrived safely. When Sophia finally reached the town, the harsh midday sun was already baking the cobblestone streets of Oakhaven. The bustling noise of the market was at its peak. The heavy scents of exotic spices, cured tobacco, dried meats, and aged cheese filled the air. Sophia was physically exhausted. Her ruined shoes were caked in the thick red dust of the mountain road, and her faded dress clearly showed the fresh hand-sewn patches. Yet she walked with her head held high straight to Mrs. Higgins's general store, completely ignoring the judgmental stares and sharp whispers of the wealthy women crowding the sidewalks. Upon entering the busy establishment, she carefully selected a pound of pinto beans, a small tin of lard, a sack of cornmeal, and a small block of raw lye soap. Just as she was slowly counting out her copper pennies on the scratched wooden counter, the piercing, shrill sound of cruel laughter sliced through the store. It was Eleanor, the pharmacist's daughter, flanked by two equally wealthy friends draped in plush velvet coats and wide hats adorned with imported silk ribbons. Eleanor stopped dead in the middle of the store, dramatically crossed her arms, and glared at Sophia with profound disgust, pursing her ruby-red painted lips. With a voice intentionally loud enough for every single customer in the store to hear, she pointed a gloved finger at Sophia's meager basket and asked with venomous irony if the life of a princess up in her stone pigsty was treating her well. Eleanor's friends let out high-pitched giggles, politely covering their mouths with their fine lace gloves. Mrs. Higgins tried to quickly intervene, demanding respect and quiet inside her establishment, but Eleanor was entirely determined to spill her poison. She took a threatening step toward Sophia and began to verbally tear her apart without mercy. She called her a pathetic wretch, a desperate, love-struck beggar, and loudly declared that it was an absolute disgrace to the respectable women of the town to see someone willingly degrade herself by living in pure filth with a starving failure who didn't even have a pot to piss in. Eleanor openly mocked Sophia's ruined shoes, laughed wickedly at the prominent patches on her dress, and finished her brutal assault by declaring that a woman who willingly accepts the squalor of a failed, worthless lumberjack possesses no self-respect whatsoever, only pathetic desperation. Hidden completely out of sight behind a massive stack of flour and grain sacks near the store's entrance, Vincent heard every single word as if they were jagged knives plunging directly into his chest. His fists were clenched so incredibly tight that his fingernails were drawing real blood from his palms. The explosive urge to step out from behind those sacks, scream his true identity to the heavens, buy the entire general store with a single wad of cash, and humiliate Eleanor in front of the whole town was almost physically impossible to control. He wanted to roar that the ragged woman they were insulting was the future lady of the Crystal Estate. But before Vincent could take a single reckless step, Sophia's voice echoed clearly through the tense silence of the store. It was not a voice trembling with unshed tears. There was absolutely no desperation and no shame. It was a firm, unwaveringly calm voice, laden with a powerful dignity that instantly silenced the entire room. Sophia turned slowly to face Eleanor, calmly adjusting the frayed edges of her shawl over her shoulders. She looked directly into the vain, shallow eyes of the pharmacist's daughter and clearly stated that she held absolutely no shame for her ruined shoes, because those shoes walked daily along paths of pure honesty that Eleanor's velvet heels would never, ever have the strength to endure. With a serene, piercing eloquence that only truly noble souls possess, Sophia patiently explained that true misery was not found on a packed dirt floor or in the agonizing lack of coins in a pocket. True poverty, she said, was the sickening poverty of the spirit, the dark sickness of a soul that feels the pathetic need to step on others just to feel tall. She defended Vincent with a fierce, breathtaking bravery that made the hidden lumberjack's own eyes overflow with thick, hot tears in the shadows. Sophia declared, loudly and proudly for anyone who cared to listen, that her companion was a fiercely honorable man. He sweated through his shirt from sunrise to sunset, without ever stealing or deceiving a single living soul, and the rough, calloused hands of his hard labor held infinitely more value and true nobility than all the hoarded gold hidden in that town. She finished her stunning rebuke by stating that she would choose the freezing wind of her stone cabin, where deep respect resided. 1,000 times over the artificial warmth of a rich house, built purely on a foundation of arrogance and empty vanity. The silence that followed inside the general store was absolute and deafening. Not a single soul dared to breathe a word. Mrs. Higgins broke into a wide smile, her eyes shining with tears of profound pride as she pushed Sophia's wrapped groceries across the counter and slid 2 of the pennies back to her, whispering warmly that the lye soap was on the house. Eleanor stood frozen in place, her face burning a violent shade of red from sheer fury and public humiliation. She couldn't find a single word to counter the towering greatness of the orphaned laundress who had just reduced her to absolute nothingness with the sheer, unadulterated force of the truth. Sophia calmly picked up her heavy basket, thanked Mrs. Higgins with a deep, respectful nod, and walked out of the store, heading back toward the towering mountain with her head held impeccably high, leaving behind a heavy trail of silent awe and admiration from every person in the room. On the brutal trek back up the mountain, exhaustion finally began to collect its toll. The sun hid behind the jagged mountain peaks much earlier than usual, and terrifying heavy black clouds began to rapidly swallow the sky, heralding an exceptionally violent storm. The wind suddenly shifted direction, carrying a biting, icy chill that sliced right to the bone. Vincent, who was sprinting up the shortcut to beat her back and avoid exposing his disguise, felt his chest tighten in absolute panic at the sudden violent shift in the weather. When he finally crested the cliff, gasping for air, the sky was the color of bruised lead, and the first deep rumbles of thunder began to growl ominously in the distance, echoing fiercely through the Douglas fir valleys. Nature itself seemed to be preparing for the grand climax of a trial that would alter their lives forever. He bolted inside the stone cabin and began frantically stacking kindling and wood to build a roaring fire before Sophia arrived. Vincent's deep anguish was no longer about the foolish test. He was now consumed by a crushing, agonizing shame for having allowed the love of his life to endure vicious public humiliation in the streets, forcing her to carry the heavy cross of his fake poverty, all just to soothe his own ego that had been bruised by past disillusionments. Destiny's cruel game was finally demanding a steep price, and the impending storm was about to wash away truths that could no longer be hidden behind crumbling rustic walls and torn, dirty clothes. The sky over Crystal Valley blackened with terrifying speed, devouring the last faint traces of evening light beneath a thick, suffocating blanket of leaden clouds. The deafening crack of the first lightning strike made the dirt floor of the cabin vibrate violently, echoing down the gorge of the waterfall like a massive beast awakening. Vincent paced back and forth like a caged animal, constantly feeding the iron stove with thick shards of pine until the flames danced wildly, radiating intense heat. Pure agony squeezed his chest with iron claws. He knew exactly how treacherous the 11-mile trail between Oak Haven and the ridge was, littered with loose shale and mud, and the terrifying image of Sophia fighting that climb alone, carrying heavy supplies under the threat of a lethal winter storm, tortured his mind endlessly. With every violent gust of freezing wind that shrieked through the cracks in the stone, the massive guilt of maintaining his senseless charade grew heavier on his broad shoulders. He stepped up to the groaning wooden door and peered out into the pitch-black darkness of the pine forest, squinting hard against the first fat, freezing drops of rain that began to fall. And right then, He spotted her small, fragile silhouette emerging from the thick mist and the shadows of the violently swaying trees. Sophia was struggling to walk, her small shoulders hunched protectively against the merciless wind, clutching the woven basket of food tight against her chest as if she were guarding a sacred treasure. The soles of her ruined shoes were completely gone, and the bottom of her dress was thoroughly soaked and weighed down by thick red mountain mud. Vincent didn't pause for a single second. He charged out of the cabin, completely ignoring the freezing rain that was now coming down in sheets, and ran to meet her in the dark. Without uttering a word, he snatched the heavy basket from her freezing, calloused hands and, in a fiercely protective instinct, wrapped his massive arm tightly around her soaked shoulders, quickly guiding her out of the storm and into the safety of the cabin. When he finally slammed the heavy wooden door shut, barricading them against the worst of nature's fury, Sophia collapsed back against the stone wall. She was panting heavily, her face as pale as a ghost from absolute physical exhaustion. Yet her brown eyes sparkled brightly with a quiet, undeniable victory. She pointed a trembling finger at the basket on the rickety table, and between ragged gasps of freezing air, told Vincent that she had successfully bought the beans, the flour, and the lard. They finally had hot food to survive the dark, freezing days ahead. Vincent stared at the meager supplies she had secured with those pathetic coins, vividly remembering the jaw-dropping courage with which she had fiercely defended his honor against Eleanor's cruel taunts down in the store. A single, scalding hot tear escaped his eye, tracing a path down his rough face and mixing silently with the icy rainwater. He quickly dragged the wooden bench closer to the roaring stove, his voice thick and choked with emotion as he begged her to sit near the intense heat. He frantically searched for the only clean, dry towel left in the entire hovel. With a surprising, breathtaking gentleness that brutally contrasted with his massive size and rough lumberjack appearance, Vincent began to carefully dry Sophia's long, dark, soaking wet hair. The rich, earthy scents of heavy rain, damp soil, and clean lye soap completely filled the tiny room. Sophia closed her eyes, utterly exhausted, simply allowing him to care for her. His large hands trembled faintly as they grazed her cold shoulders, and in that simple, hesitant touch, laden with an infinite unspoken tenderness, all the immense love that had been quietly cultivated over the past 3 weeks seemed to finally overflow. She slowly opened her deep brown eyes and stared right into his soul, her face softly illuminated by the golden, flickering light of the embers. With a tired, beautiful smile, she softly whispered that the raging storm outside didn't matter at all anymore, because right there inside, sitting by the warm fire and sitting next to him, she finally felt that she had found her true home. Her words struck Vincent with the paralyzing force of a lightning bolt. He felt a wild, desperate urge to drop to his knees right there in the mud, confess that he was the undisputed king of the Cascade Mountains, and swear on his life that she would never, ever feel the bite of the cold again. But just as he opened his mouth to spill the massive truth, the raw fury of nature decided to violently intervene. An exceptionally brutal gust of cyclonic wind slammed directly into the side of the stone cabin. The old wooden window, its iron hinges already severely rotted by decades of rust, burst violently open with a deafening crash, slamming hard against the interior wall. Instantly, the torrential freezing rain and the howling wind invaded the small space, blowing out the smoke and violently threatening to extinguish the fire that was keeping them alive. Vincent lunged across the room toward the window, throwing the entire weight of his muscular body against the heavy wooden shutters, trying desperately to force them shut against the monstrous power of the gale. The freezing rain lashed at his face like whips, instantly soaking his flannel shirt to the bone. He fought a brutal war against the wind, his heavy boots slipping dangerously in the mud that was rapidly forming on the floor, the muscles in his arms bulging and straining to their absolute limits. Sophia, seeing him fighting a losing battle, didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. She abandoned the life-saving heat of the stove, sprinted across the freezing room, and threw her delicate body against the wood right next to Vincent. Together, combining her frantic, desperate strength with his, they slowly forced the shutters closed and finally threw the heavy, rusted iron latch into place. Gasping wildly for air, the two of them slid down the rough stone wall until they collapsed onto the muddy dirt floor, completely drenched to the bone and shaking violently, uncontrollably. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted to a lethal degree. The freezing mountain runoff penetrated deep into Vincent's bones, and his lips began to turn a dangerous shade of blue. He was a man accustomed to the luxurious, roaring fireplaces of his grand manor, and this real, agonizing exposure was quickly taking its toll. It was right then, in the freezing dark, that Sophia made the profound gesture that would permanently seal their destinies together. Seeing the massive man beside her violently chattering his teeth from the hypothermic cold, she reached up and untied her own thick brown wool shawl. It was the absolute only warm piece of clothing she possessed, and it was the most sacred, precious memory she had of her deceased mother. Without hesitating for a single heartbeat, completely ignoring the fact that her own skin was rapidly turning to ice beneath her thin, soaked cotton dress, she firmly wrapped the heavy shawl around Vincent's broad, shivering shoulders. She grabbed him by the shirt, yanked his massive frame closer to hers, and hugged him with all her might, desperately trying to transfer the last tiny spark of body heat she had left. Vincent's eyes widened in sheer shock at the magnitude of her sacrifice. He tried to physically fight her off, stuttering through blue lips that she was going to catch pneumonia and die if she stayed without the shawl. And he tried to push the wool back onto her shoulders. But Sophia gripped his rough hands with astonishing, unyielding strength. She stared deeply into the eyes of the man she had chosen to love and declared, with a fiery, absolute conviction that burned brighter than any stove, that the bitter cold possessed no power to strike down someone whose heart is kept ablaze by true love. She fiercely added that she would rather freeze in the harshest winter on earth than watch the man who had given her hope suffer for a single second. Those powerful words shattered the very last defensive walls surrounding Vincent's hardened heart. His heavy armor of suspicion, painfully forged over years of dealing with fake, greedy sycophants, turned to dust right there on the muddy dirt floor. He finally realized the staggering, immeasurable worth of the jewel he held in his arms. Sophia hadn't just tolerated his manufactured poverty, she had embraced it. She hadn't just shared the heavy burden, she had thrown herself into the fire for him. Vincent pressed his wet forehead against hers, tightly squeezed his eyes shut, and finally allowed the hot tears to stream freely down his face, washing away the rain and the years of bitterness. Right there, sitting in a puddle of freezing mud inside the most pathetic, ruined hovel on the mountain, fiercely clutching an orphaned laundress in the middle of a brutal storm, the multi-millionaire Vincent finally felt like the richest, most fortunate, and most deeply loved man on the face of the earth. He took a deep, shuddering breath, inhaling the intoxicating scent of rain and pure courage that radiated from her skin, and firmly decided that the agonizing test was officially over. If you also believe that true, unwavering love is revealed precisely in the darkest moments of hardship, and that pure humility will always find its ultimate reward, hit that like button and comment below telling me the most beautiful sacrifice you've ever seen someone make for love, because the biggest twist of this entire story is about to drop. The agonizing night dragged on, slow and utterly merciless, But the two of them remained tightly locked in a desperate embrace near the stove, fiercely keeping the fading flames alive until the monstrous wind finally began to die down in the early hours of dawn. When the morning sun finally broke over the horizon, the silence that fell over Crystal Valley was absolute, pristine, and deeply reverent. The brilliant winter sun crested the jagged peaks of the Cascades, flooding the mountain range with a crisp, golden and blindingly clear light that made the millions of frozen raindrops clinging to the pine needles sparkle like a forest of scattered diamonds. Sophia slowly woke up, feeling a strange, comforting warmth. She fluttered her eyes open and realized she was lying comfortably on the wooden pallet, carefully tucked in with both the wool shawl and the heavy blanket. Vincent was standing perfectly still in the direct center of the cabin. He was wearing the exact same ragged clothes, now completely dried by the fire, but he was staring down at her with an intensely profound, indecipherable expression. Vincent's eyes no longer held the weary gaze of a broken lumberjack, nor the dark shadows of a man embittered by betrayal. There was a towering, majestic pride and a deep, unshakable serenity radiating from his posture. He smiled, a massive, brilliant smile overflowing with a profound peace that Sophia had never seen on a human face before. He slowly walked over to the bed, extended his large, heavily calloused hand, and gently asked her to rise. He spoke with a shockingly calm, smooth voice, declaring that there would be no chopping of wood and no scrubbing of laundry in freezing water today. He promised her, with a twinkle in his eye, that he wanted to show her a very special, secret place on the mountain, a place where the sunlight hit a little differently. Sophia was entirely confused, but she trusted this man with her life. She took his hand without hesitation. She smoothed out the severe wrinkles in her damp cotton dress, draped the brown shawl securely over her shoulders, and followed him out into the biting morning air. The landscape was absolutely breathtaking, completely washed clean by the violence of the storm, radiating the powerful, crisp scent of a fresh beginning. Instead of turning left down the treacherous, steep trail toward the town, or walking right toward the roaring waterfall, Vincent firmly guided her straight ahead into a dense, hidden path cut directly through the thickest part of the forest behind the cabin. They plunged into a section of the Douglas fir woods that looked completely ancient and untouched by human hands. They walked side by side for 20 minutes, their hands tightly interlocked, feeling the spongy, damp earth yield softly beneath their battered shoes. Sophia nervously whispered, asking where exactly they were going, her curiosity tinged with a slight anxiety about the sudden, intense mystery. But Vincent only smiled warmly, squeezing her hand and gently asking her to hold on to her patience for just a little while longer. After walking through the labyrinth of massive, centuries-old tree trunks, the dense forest suddenly began to thin out. The lonely whistle of the wind through the pines was abruptly replaced by the distant rhythmic sounds of human voices and highly organized agricultural activity. And then, as if a giant magical curtain had been dramatically ripped away, the dark tree line ended, instantly revealing a massive, perfectly manicured and sun-drenched valley. The sheer shock of the sight caused Sophia to stop dead in her tracks, her feet suddenly refusing to move. Looming spectacularly before her wide, disbelieving eyes stood the most overwhelmingly massive and opulent estate she had ever seen or could have ever imagined. The Crystal Manor dominated the landscape with its towering classical architecture. Massive white marble columns gleamed blindingly under the morning sun, surrounded on all sides by mathematically perfect, symmetrical gardens overflowing with blooming white roses and towering stone fountains spewing crystal-clear water. The long, sweeping driveway leading up to the colossal double oak doors was paved with flawlessly cut white cobblestones. In the green distance, dozens of magnificent purebred horses grazed peacefully inside pristine white-fenced pastures, and an absolute ocean of sprawling apple orchards and golden wheat fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon, as far as the human eye could see. Standing in perfectly disciplined, silent lines across the massive front veranda of the mansion were dozens of servants, all dressed in impeccable, crisp uniforms. Standing proudly at the very front of the line was old Silas, the grizzled foreman, everyone waiting in a deeply respectful, stunned silence. Sophia literally felt the oxygen vanish from her lungs. She stared in horrified awe at the colossal palace in front of her, then looked down in absolute panic at her own pathetic, stitched-together dress and her ruined mud-caked shoes. Trembling with genuine fear, she finally turned her pale face up to Vincent, who was still holding her hand with a grip of iron. With a severely shaking voice, reduced to a terrified, breathless whisper, she asked him what this impossible place was and what on earth they were doing trespassing on the property of such a terrifyingly wealthy man. She was absolutely terrified that guards with rifles would emerge at any second to throw them in prison for trespassing. Vincent stopped right in front of her on the gleaming white stones. He gently took her terrified face in both of his large, calloused hands. Looking deeper into her soul than he ever had before, with a gaze overflowing with unbreakable, absolute devotion, he finally shattered the illusion and revealed the massive truth. He explained, his deep voice thick and trembling with raw emotion, that the terrifyingly wealthy man she was so afraid of did not exist, because the undisputed master of this entire valley was simply the poor lumberjack she had saved from freezing to death the night before. He confessed plainly and without reservation that the crystal manor, the endless orchards, the mountains, the rivers, and absolutely everything her beautiful brown eyes could see belonged entirely to him. With hot tears of pure liberation streaming down his face, Vincent explained exactly how he had locked his entire life away behind those luxurious oak doors to escape the suffocating greed of the world, intentionally building a brutal trap of misery in a ruined cabin just to see if he could find a single soul who would love his true essence and not his bank accounts. Right there, on the perfectly manicured white cobblestone path, the multimillionaire dropped to both his knees, tightly holding Sophia's shaking hands against his chest. He passionately declared that many women had climbed that mountain in search of golden promises, but every single one of them had run away from the leaky roof and the dirt floor in sheer arrogant disgust. Only she, the poor laundress with the bruised hands and the heart forged of solid gold, possessed the immense courage to stay and the breathtaking nobility to transform the worst, most miserable place on earth into a warm, loving home. Vincent reverently kissed both of her rough hands and officially announced that the cruel test was over for the rest of eternity. He swore to her that, from this second onward, her days of back-breaking labor and deep loneliness were permanently finished, and that she would not walk through those massive oak doors as a servant or a temporary guest, but as the sole, legitimate queen and absolute master of everything he owned. The sheer monumental impact of the revelation caused Sophia's legs to give out completely. A dam broke inside her, and tears cascaded down her face in rivers, not because of the shocking money, the horses, or the colossal mansion, but because of the absolute, overwhelming beauty of the profound love and absolute trust this incredible man had just placed in her hands. She forcefully pulled him up from his knees, threw her arms violently around his thick neck, and crushed him in the exact same desperate, fiercely protective embrace she had used to save him on the night of the storm. The deeply passionate kiss that followed was the absolute, unshakable seal of an eternal promise. It was greeted by an eruption of timid, relieved applause from the dozens of servants on the veranda, who were weeping with joy to see their beloved employer finally happy, healed, and permanently cured of the dark sorrow that had haunted him for so many years. 3 days later, the explosive rumor that swept down the mountain hit the arrogant town of Oakhaven like an apocalyptic hurricane. The midday sun was beating down hard when an unbelievably luxurious, polished hardwood carriage, pulled by 4 towering, flawless white horses, rolled smoothly down the cobblestone street and came to a perfect stop exactly in front of Mrs. Higgins' general store. The heavy carriage door was pulled open by a uniformed driver, and out stepped Vincent. He was cleanly shaven, his hair perfectly styled, wearing an immaculately tailored expensive British wool suit that fit his muscular frame like a glove, looking every inch the powerful timber baron he truly was. He extended a finely gloved hand into the velvet interior of the carriage, and out stepped Sophia. She wasn't dripping in gaudy jewels or wearing a heavy diamond crown to show off. Instead, she wore an incredibly elegant, beautifully tailored navy blue velvet dress, her thick, dark hair styled flawlessly beneath a delicate, tasteful hat. The truly majestic, intimidating posture she carried, however, did not come from the expensive fabric she wore, but from the absolute, unshakable peace and power that radiated from her serene face. The loud, bustling noise of the street evaporated instantly. People froze exactly where they stood, their jaws literally dropping to the floor in absolute shock, desperately trying to comprehend how the pathetic orphaned laundress and the starving lumberjack had miraculously transformed into the most terrifyingly wealthy, powerful tycoon in Crystal Valley and his stunning, elegant wife. Standing on the sidewalk right in front of the store, Eleanor, the pharmacist's daughter, physically dropped her expensive lace parasol onto the dirty cobblestones. Every single drop of blood violently drained from Eleanor's face, leaving her looking as pale and sickly as white wax. The crushing, horrific realization that the very woman she had brutally, publicly humiliated just days ago was now the undisputed master of a fortune she couldn't even begin to comprehend, paralyzed her completely. The bitter, acidic taste of profound regret and the blinding realization of her own colossal stupidity hit her with the force of a speeding train. She had been given the exact same opportunity. She had stood face to face with the master of that massive empire, but she had allowed her arrogant disgust for poverty to completely blind her to the gold standing in front of her. Sophia walked right past Eleanor without uttering a single petty word of vengeance, without even a tiny smirk of cruel satisfaction. She knew that the absolute greatest punishment for bitter envy is the crushing, total indifference of the one who won the war with pure dignity. Sophia simply glided into the store, warmly and fiercely hugged a weeping Mrs. Higgins, thanked her sincerely for the deep compassion of the Free Lie soap, and loudly declared that from this day until the end of time, this humble store would be the exclusive, official supplier for the colossal crystal estate, instantly guaranteeing the kind-hearted old woman eternal prosperity and immense wealth. Their incredible story echoed through the decades, cementing itself as the most beautiful, legendary tale ever spoken in those mountains. Time flowed forward, serene and endlessly abundant. Exactly 40 years rolled over Crystal Valley like a peaceful, deep river. In the year 1974, the crisp autumn wind was busy painting the leaves of the towering trees in vibrant shades of gold and deep crimson. Sitting quietly on the massive marble veranda of the Crystal Manor, 2 figures with hair as white as fresh snow rested comfortably in intricately carved wooden rocking chairs. Vincent and Sophia stared out at the infinite horizon, their hands tightly interlocked, their faces mapped with deep, beautiful lines that told the story of decades of shared laughter, incredible triumphs, and a profound love that had only grown fiercer and stronger with the passing of time. The vast estate had multiplied and prospered beyond any human measure, and a massive portion of their immense fortune had been quietly given away to build schools for the workers' children and safe havens for the most desperate and needy in the region. Vincent gently squeezed Sophia's delicate, aging hand, a hand that still bore the faint, proud scars of a woman who had once fought a brutal war for her very survival, and he tenderly brought the back of her hand to his lips, kissing his eternal queen. They slowly pulled their gaze away from the endless, sprawling valleys of the estate and focused their eyes high up on the distant, jagged cliff. There, firmly braving the winds and the decades, the thick stone walls of the ruined, abandoned hovel still stood strong, constantly embraced by the thick, eternal mist of the roaring waterfall. That tiny, broken cabin, intentionally kept exactly as it was by direct order of both of them for over 4 decades, stood as the ultimate stone monument to the greatest truth of their lives. It was the eternal, undeniable proof that true poverty is never found in a lack of money, but only in a tragic lack of love. And it proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the greatest, most staggering wealth in the entire world doesn't sleep inside crystal mansions, but wakes up every single morning next to the absolute right person, someone entirely willing to transform any miserable dirt floor into the most beautiful, majestic castle in the universe.